We are going to start. So, good evening. My name is Anna Abram. I'm principal of the Margaret Beaufort Institute, and it is my privilege and pleasure to welcome you all, both in person and online. And we have a good crowd of people joining us online to this special interfaith panel discussion. And a very special welcome to our distinguished guests, Professor Anna Abulafia, Professor Emerita of the Study of the Abrahamic Religions, Oxford University, who will chair the discussion. And special welcome to our speakers, Dr. Ed Kessler, founder president of the Wolf Institute, Dr. Tim Winter, Dean of the Cambridge Muslim College, and Professor Michael Barnes, honorary fellow of our institute, who is on his way. He is in the taxi. He will join as soon as possible. So my role this evening, apart from welcoming you, is to say just a few words about our institute, especially for those who are joining us for the first time. So we are a Roman Catholic member of Cambridge Theological Federation, a body of 12 institutions representing different Christian denominations, and one interfaith institute, Wolf Institute, with whom for many years Margaret Beaufort Institute had the pleasure to build friendship and share physical home. So this is a really great joy to have friends from the Institute, and thank you, Ed, for all your support over the years. And this year, our Institute celebrates its 30th anniversary, Pearl anniversary, and this is one of the significant pearls. This event is one of the pearls. Our work at the Institute falls under three equally important strands: teaching at all levels, pastoral outreach by resourcing parishes, schools, prisons, and hospital chaplaincies, and also research. And we have about, actually now exactly 50 research associates and fellows. We have recently moved to our temporary home at Wesley House and Jesus Lane, and we share it with Wesley House and IOX Orthodox Institute. And the Institute constantly grows and develops. This evening's event not only fits in with our aim to continue and develop further our dialogical mode of theological engagement, which goes beyond boundaries of our own religious belonging and identity, it also takes place at a significant time in our history, the history of our broken world, when interfaith dialogue is more needed than ever. And finally, it represents, or rather responds, quite well to what Pope Francis instructs us in his motu proprio, the document or a letter that really just came out. It hasn't been yet translated into English. It was only issued 2 weeks ago. And this document instructs what theological education should be about. The document is called Ad Theologiam Promovendam, Promoting Theology. And in this document, Pope Francis calls for the reimagining of theological education and for epistemological and methodological rethinking. He wants theology to embody a culture of dialogue and practice of an encounter between different traditions and different types of knowledge, between Christian denominations and different religions, and people of no religion and no faith. Francis wants theology to be a study of multiplicity of viewpoints. I think our institute, even if modestly, has been practicing the theology of dialogue for some time, but there is still so much for us to learn and develop. And for this reason, this evening is also important to us, to learn together how to dialogue and what the dialogue should involve. So thank you again for joining us. A special thanks to the Divinity Faculty for allowing us to host this discussion here. And thank you to my brilliant colleagues for all their work in making this event happen. So now it is my great pleasure to hand over to Suzanne Jennings, President of the Margaret Beaufort Association, and Dr. Pawlina Kasparova, sitting there, who is a co-organizer of our Pearl Anniversary set of events. So thank you so much.
So good evening. It's a great pleasure to introduce this evening's panel discussion, 30 years of dialogue among the Abrahamic faiths, which forms, as Anna was saying, a pivotal point in this year's calendar to celebrate 30 years of the foundation of the Margaret Beaufort Institute. And we'd like to give special thanks to the Tablet for having very kindly sponsored this event. I would like to introduce now our chair, whom we're honoured to have, Professor Anna Abulafia, who will.
Right. Well, so we're here to talk about 30 years of dialogue among the Abrahamic faiths. So I have a tidy mind, and I kind of thought, well, why don't we just first think a little bit about what the Abrahamic religions or faiths actually are? Because it's a term that we bandy about quite a lot, but what do we actually mean by it? Now, looking at your panel, it's, well, there's one person still missing, but you can, I think, work that one out. Obviously, most of us think simply about Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. But there are actually more religions that really would be quite keen to join the Abrahamic tribe, as it were. I'm thinking of the Baha'i, we've got the Druze, we've got the Ratasfari, the Samaritans. There are other groups for whom Abraham is a pivotal figure. But the other thing, and this is one of my really pet projects, I suppose, I think it's desperately important, and actually Anna Abraham actually was referring to it. We do need to remember that there isn't one Judaism. None of us represents the only Judaism, the only Christianity, the only Islam. Even though spell check doesn't like Judaisms, Islams and Christianities, and tells you that you really have to correct that. In fact, they do exist. And an obvious partner to interfaith is intrafaith. We're doing interfaith tonight, but I think we do need to be aware of those differences. And another thing, and I think this is quite important, I am a historian, I suppose a theological historian or a historical, I don't know, theologian, whatever. But I do think it's quite important to know where these terms come from. And one of the things we need to realize is nowadays, for us, it is so very obvious that Islam is part of the Abrahamic threesome. How else could it be? But it is important to remember that it wasn't always the case. And the work of a French Islamicist, Louis Massignon, in the first half of the 20th century, he really has a lot to his credit there. He turned to the figure of Abraham to expand thinking around Judeo-Christian phenomena to include Islam. And he had a very particular purpose. This was at the time of very difficult, to put it mildly, relations between the French with the Muslims and in the Middle East and North Africa. And he was very keen that those relations should be improved. And in 1908, Massignon underwent an intense mystical experience in Iraq, and that brought him back to the Catholicism of his youth. And that conversion started Massignon on a mission to find a positive place for Islam in Roman Catholic thinking. Now, the way he went about that might not be something the way we would do it nowadays. It's neither here nor there. What is important for us is that Massignon insisted on recognizing the Quran as a repository of divine inspiration. And at that time, within the Roman Catholic Church, that was pretty revolutionary. And in his eyes, the faith of Abraham was revitalized through Islam. Now, through his efforts and the efforts of others, Islam has now been properly added to that Judeo-Christian paradigm. And really from the 1960s, the Abrahamic terminology has been used very widely in interfaith programs. And in fact, a number of professorial chairs were endowed at various universities, including this place, but also the other place where I actually held my chair. Sorry, I'm not apologizing for that, but I was in Oxford. And when I held that chair, I've recently retired, obviously people asked me, well, okay, Abrahamic religions, fine. Does it work? Is it a really good term? Is that actually appropriate? And when you hold a chair of that name, it's kind of important to find an answer, and you kind of want to find a positive answer. So I did some very hard thinking on that. And it is, of course, true that reflections on Abraham have played an immensely important role in the development of all three of these faith traditions. That's obvious enough. But unfortunately, what's also obvious is that within each tradition, those reflections have led to quite a bit of animosity between the three religions, and each religion having its own tradition of interpretation, which made the other into the opposite. So it works both ways. Now, obviously, I mean, that shouldn't really surprise us because, you know, Abraham was the head of a patriarchal family, which was one of the most dysfunctional families one could actually imagine. If you think about all of the spousal problems, the favoritism that parents show their children. I'm thinking now especially of the Hebrew Bible. So, you know, and all of the hatred between brothers and half-brothers and all the rest of it, sisters get a little bit less of a look in there. But it's not surprising that the Abrahamic heritage, you know, you can take it, you know, we love each other, we all have the same, if you like, urvater, but it can also be used to pit one religion against the other. So I had to ask myself, well, does that actually disqualify the term? And unsurprisingly, I've concluded that it doesn't, but it does have to be used wisely. And by that, I mean, one should only use it if one is always aware of the complexities of the term. And I would even argue that the incongruity of the term is useful because it forces us to think why and how the memory of Abraham can act as both a unifying and a divisive factor in Jewish, Christian, Muslim relations. And to my mind, that widens our horizons as we investigate the different ways in which Judaism, Christianity, and Islam evolved alongside each other and in opposition to each other over the past. And this, to my mind, counteracts the natural tendencies we all have to simplify the past by approaching it from our own narrow perspective, be that Christocentric, Islamocentric, or Judeocentric. I also think that the Abrahamic lens helps us to recognize just how heterogeneous all three world religions are and always have been. And I should add at this point that it's also important to remember that these three religious traditions did not just interact with each other, they developed in diverse religious landscapes, which included non-Abrahamic traditions. And the obvious ones to think about if we're thinking of world religions is, of course, Buddhism and Hinduism. And, you know, Abrahamic religions is meant to be an inclusive term, but I do think we must remember that it excludes an awful big chunk of humanity. And I think it's also important to remember that. Anyway, I hope that sets you thinking about the complexities of the term and the nuances needed. And I'm now going to turn to the panel. And I'll add a few introductory remarks about each of the panelists. And then they have been asked to address two things. A, from their own religious perspective, what has been the best result from the past 30 years of dialogue amongst the Abrahamic religions, and B, from their own religious perspective, what is the most pressing issue for dialogue among the Abrahamic religions today. And they're supposed to do that in about 15 minutes each, something like that. But we'll see how we go along.
Give or take.
What?
Give or take.
Give or take, absolutely. Anyway, I always in these things work chronologically. We may have to break the chronology. It's according to Michael's taxi. But we'll start with Ed Kessler. And as Anna already told us, he is, of course, the founder of the incredibly successful Wolf Institute. He's also a fellow of St. Edmund's College. He's written a huge amount of books. And he is, of course, is still incredibly active in interfaith matters. He was convener and vice chair of the Commission on Religion and Belief in British Public Life, which published a major policy report, Living with Difference. And he was also principal investigator of the Wolf Diversity Study, and that ended up in a policy report, How We Get Along. And to my right, Tim Winter, yes, founder and dean of the Cambridge Muslim College, also the Sheikh Zayed Lecturer of Islamic Studies. And I suspect we have some of your students here, presumably, no? One would hope, maybe.
One or two.
Okay, that would be great. Also very, very active in interfaith. And of course, very importantly, he's the one who started the Cambridge Mosque Project, and that resulted in the Cambridge Central Mosque, which I'm sure everyone would agree is an absolutely fantastic architectural delight. Anyway, Ed, let's start with you.
Okay, thank you, Anna. And I'm Mazel Tov. Congratulations, 30 years, can you believe it? I remember the day when the CJCR, the Centre for the Study of Jewish-Christian Relations, as we were in the very beginning, arrived in Wesley House in 1998, and Sister Bridget was planning to leave Wesley House and move to your home at Grange Road. So we followed you about 14 years later and very much enjoyed the hospitality that you provided before moving to Westminster College, where we are now with our friends in the United Reformed Church. But really, congratulations on this remarkable achievement. We will always be 5 years behind you. And before I begin, I want to tell you about the latest invention at the Wolf Institute, which is a car powered not by petrol, but by faith. And all you need to do is to say, thank God, and get the car going. And you say, amen, and it slows down. So naturally, we approached the chief rabbi to say, let's try the car. So Rabbi Mervis got in the car, said, thank God, and off it went. And it was going a bit too slowly. So he said, thank God, a bit louder. And it was going a bit faster. And then he saw the edge of the cliff and he said, amen, and nothing happened. And so he said, amen, a bit nervously, and still nothing happened. And he shouted, amen. And the car screeched to a halt with two wheels over the edge. And then he went back and said, thank God. Okay. So my reflections, that doesn't count in my 15 minutes. My reflections this afternoon will bring together these two topics that Anna has outlined. What are the most pressing issues in the interfaith encounter? And what are the best results of the Abrahamic dialogue? And I'm going to start and put them together and start with what I consider to be the most pressing issue. So just imagine for a moment a critic or a child of yours, or mine for that matter, asking, how do you solve the problem that has led people to kill one another in the name of God since the birth of civilization? At the end of the day, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam all claim to be true. They conflict. Therefore, they cannot all be true. At most, one is, if Christianity is true, Judaism and Islam are false. If Islam is true, then Christianity and Judaism are false. It follows that these religions are bound to conflict whenever their followers take their truth claims seriously. I, for my part, my critic continues, take this as sufficient evidence that all three are false. For how could the God of all humanity command his followers to deny the full and equal humanity of those who conceive him differently? I would rather live with the uncertainty of doubt than the certainty of faith. For it is that very certainty that leads people convinced of their righteousness to commit unspeakable crimes. So that's the challenge. On this interfaith celebration of the 30th anniversary of the establishment of Margaret Beaufort, during a time of war in the Middle East and of protest and counter-protest on our streets, I'd like to reflect on the issue of how we can live peaceably together whilst at the same time honouring the commitments of our respective faiths. Whilst I may be convinced of the truth of Judaism, Christians and Muslims in this room believe with equal fervour that their faith, not mine, is true. As a Jewish theologian, I turn to the covenant to help me explore this issue. When the Bible describes God as saying to Moses, Anochi koret berit, I make a covenant, morality becomes relational. Whilst the Bible records God as seeing, for example, the episode of the golden calf, God told Moses, I've seen this people and they are a stiff-necked people. The covenant is not seen. It is spoken, it is heard, it is declared, it is heeded, it is assented to. It belongs to the culture of the ear, not the eye. Now, words can be used not just to describe the world, but to create relationships, to make promises, to undertake obligations. When I say sincerely and seriously, I promise to do better, I'm not merely describing something, but doing something, i.e. making a promise. When a Jewish groom under a wedding canopy called a chuppah gives his bride a ring and says, behold, you are betrothed to me by this ring according to the laws of Moses and Israel, he's not speaking about a marriage, he's creating one. So the covenant informs us what we are called on to do, and equally important, what we are to refrain from doing. The language of covenant shifts from description to prescription, from what is to what ought to be, from what human beings are to an ethical statement about what we may or may not do. It is a move from things seen to things heard, from the visual to the practical construction of a flourishing pluralist society. So from a Jewish point of view, the Jewish world is defined by things heard. Our key practices are study and prayer, the word addressed by human beings to God, and the word addressed by God to humanity. This stands in contrast to a language saturated with visual metaphors for knowledge. We speak of insight, foresight, of a view, a perspective, a vision. We call people perceptive. When we understand something, we say, I see. In Judaism, however, the key metaphors are all auditory. In the Talmud, phrases referring to knowledge, understanding, or tradition are often variants of the verb shema, listen. The key biblical command is Shema Israel, hear, O Israel. And this isn't accidental. The God of the Hebrew Bible is invisible. All visual representations are forbidden, some idolatrous. Even the texture of the biblical narrative is non-visual. We have no idea what Abraham or Moses looked like. There is little or no description of landscapes. Biblical prose does not capture the play of light on surfaces. Instead, it focuses our attention on the sound and the resonance, the inflections and innuendos of the heard word. God showed himself to Moses and to the Israelites not in the image, but in the call. When Elijah perceived God, he heard only a still, small voice. Yet when I gaze at a painting or a sculpture or watch a drama or a play, I'm in a different reality from what I observe. I'm looking down at the world in front of me. I'm like Zeus from the top of Mount Olympus, interested but detached. But in the covenant, in the drama of the covenant, I'm involved. I'm part of the action. I'm seeing events as they unfold, first from this perspective, then that perspective, hearing a multiplicity of voices and struggling to discern meaning, plot, sense, purpose, trying to separate, if you like, the music from the noise. The Jewish scriptures, and I think also, interesting what Tim has to say, and the Muslim and Christian are not history in that sense. What happened to someone else, what happened sometime else to someone else. but memory. They present the story of Judaism. They tell what happened to our ancestors, and therefore, insofar as we carry on the story, to us. Our scriptures speak not of moral truths in the abstract, but of commands, which is to say, truths addressed to us, calling for our response. Sometimes, even in this divinity school, my philosophical friends tease me, saying they seek the answers to the big questions. What is knowledge? What is truth? What is really there? They tell me that a statement and its opposite can't be true. Either there is or there is not a table in this room. Either Napoleon was or was not forced to retreat from Moscow. Either the universe did or did not have a beginning in time. Well, that's fine. That works well for facts and descriptions, but it does not work well for what Viktor Frankl called humanity's search for meaning. Meaning is not found in scientific facts, pure reason, or physical description. Even Richard Dawkins notes that scientific facts entail nothing about how we should or should not act. We alone on earth, he wrote, can rebel against the tyranny of the selfish replicators. And this is where we get to the dialogue. Meaning is not found in systems, but in stories, not in nature, but in narrative. The stories we tell about ourselves, who we are, where we came from, what is our place in the universe, and what, therefore, we are called on to do. And that's why the Bible, the New and the Old Testament, and the Quran are the supreme examples of a search for meaning, and generally written in the form of a narrative. Narrative truth is not like scientific or logical truth. It does not operate on the either or of truth and falsity. Narratives contain, as Anna mentioned Pope Francis's recent statement, multiple points of view. They are open, essentially, not accidentally, to more than one interpretation, more than one level of interpretation, nor does the validity of one story exclude another. Stories do more than reflect facts about the world. They allow for interpretations. And what is true of texts, I suggest, is true of relationships. Relationships are multifaceted in a way physical facts are not. I either am or am not, slightly grey-haired, short-sighted, bespectacled, but I am simultaneously a child of my parents, the father of my children, the husband of my wife. I have friends, colleagues, neighbours, and co-religionists. I'm a citizen of England, the United Kingdom, and Europe, as well as belonging to humanity as a whole. Now, each of these obligations, each of these relations, I suggest, are covenantal, in the sense that it involves reciprocal obligations. And these obligations can conflict. Should I accept a speaking invitation or spend the evening with my family? I'm torn between my responsibilities as an interfaith leader and my duties as father and husband. But there's no principled incompatibility between these loyalties. The truth of one does not entail the falsity of the other. Objective facts are one thing, relationships that make us who we are another. Here there is no either or. Instead, there is a series of narratives. Those we tell about ourselves and others tell about us. Multiple narratives do not exclude one another. To the contrary, they help build a composite picture. Welcome, Michael. No. You're just in the nick of time.
Really?
Narratives are part of what makes us human, different, unique, unsubstitutable. Unsubstitutable, that doesn't sound right, but you know what I mean. And that's what led Jews and later Muslims to say that a single life is like a universe. Hence, the profound difference between thinking if my faith is true and conflicts with yours, then yours is false. Faith as covenant means if I and my fellow believers have a relationship with God, that does not entail you do not. I have my stories, rituals, memories, prayers, laws, customs, and you have yours. That's what makes me, me, and you, you. It's what differentiates cultures, heritages, and civilizations. The truth of one does not entail the falsity of the other. Indeed, the very words true and false seem out of place here, as if we were using words from one domain to describe phenomena belonging to another. So if the scientific question is, what can I know about the world? The covenantal question is, how shall I act and expect others to act if we are to achieve together what none of us can do alone? The former generates narratives of displacement. Truth cannot coexist with falsehood. If I'm convinced that I possess the truth, while you are sunk in error, I may try to persuade you, but if you refuse to be persuaded, I may conquer you or convert you, imposing my view by force in the name of truth. And this thinking leads to the mindset of I'm wrong, I'm right, I'm right, you're wrong, go to hell. Covenantal thinking, however, with this acknowledgement of the multiplicity of relationships and interpretations, is fundamentally opposed to displacement narratives. One of the great successes of interfaith dialogue is the recognition that we must learn to live together by making space for one another. It is opposed to the partisan self-assurance, which affects the ability to take seriously alternative opinions and engage in dialogue and makes the search for mutual understanding much more difficult. It requires, and this is a very difficult thing, it requires taking the other as seriously as you expect to be taken yourself. And that was said explicitly in the Vatican Notes to Nostra Aetate. To take the other as seriously as you take yourself. For example, when one side is wholly depicted as responsible for a conflict, the ears of the other close. Too often, advocating commitment for the well-being of one equates to a blanket condemnation of the other. And nowhere is this more evident than in discussions today about Israel and Palestine. Whether they take place in synagogues, churches, or mosques, or during marches and demonstrations, speakers tend to be advocates of one side or another, pursuing a strictly partisan agenda. The atrocities committed by Hamas in Israel on the 7th of October and the extreme severity of the Israeli military response have brought huge pressure on the Muslim and Jewish communities today, with a 12-fold increase in anti-Semitism and a 7-fold increase in Islamophobia here in the UK alone. This can lead not only to mutual incomprehension and sometimes to antipathy, but also a reluctance to engage in different narratives. For example, Muslim sympathy with Palestinians is seen by some Jews as threatening the Jewish community and feeding the rising anti-Semitism. Likewise, some Muslims and others see Jews as homogeneous in their support and defense of Israel, unwilling to accept criticism of the Jewish state. And there is a deep reluctance to acknowledge prejudice against the other within each of our communities. In response to this grim situation, the Wolf Institute has been facilitating quiet meetings between Muslims and Jews in particular, to provide an opportunity for everyone to share with one another how events in Israel and Gaza are affecting them and their communities here in the UK. And it's clear that both communities, the conversations I've had, desire to keep the channels of dialogue open, and not only to be in touch with one another, but to recognize many of the same emotions: worry, fear, anger, and the themes of the influence of the social media, the importance of friendship, worry about personal security, binary positions, as well as our children. They are present in the views of both Muslims and Jews. However, beyond the practical challenges that define the human situation as such, interfaith dialogue reminds us that relationships between God and humanity are covenantal. None excludes the other. God may be with us, but also with those who are not like us. And that's why the Torah tells us on 36 separate occasions to love the stranger, but only once to love the neighbor. Today's interfaith dialogue reminds us of a sense of meaning and purpose in history and the concepts of human responsibility and dignity. Greece and Cambridge may have produced philosophers, but our scriptures produce prophets. Greece gave us tragedy, the Abrahamic faiths, its opposite, hope. In other words, Abrahamic dialogue can help us overwhelm the shrill screams of advocacy and overcome those who generate noise, but not hope. If this is difficult, which it is, it can be said another way. My wife Tricia and I have 3 children. We love them equally and unconditionally. They are very different from one another. They have different strengths, skills, interests, and emotional needs. If we favored one at the cost of the others, we would have failed as parents. Still more would we have failed if, having loved our firstborn, we then withdrew that affection on the birth of our subsequent children, transferring it each time to the youngest. Such behavior would have damaged them all, creating rivalries, insecurities, and a sense of rejection. If that's true of human parents, how much more is it true of the Almighty? Can I really believe that God, having set his love on and made a covenant with the children of Israel, then rejected them when they continued to honor that covenant, but choosing not to follow the new faith, Christianity? Can I believe that the God of love, in loving Christians, thereby abandoned Jews? Can I make sense of the idea that 6 centuries after the birth of Christianity and 26 after the journey of Abraham, God revealed that Jews and Christians had been mistaken all along, and that their religious destiny was other than they had believed it to be? I can perfectly well understand that Ptolemy, Copernicus, Newton, perhaps even Einstein, were shown to be wrong in their scientific beliefs, and that if religion is like science, it's open to such refutations. But to think of religion on the model of science is to think that God is a concept. Our scriptures, the Bible and the Quran, remind us that God is a parent. Today, on our celebration of the 30th anniversary of Margaret Beaufort, I suggest that the Abrahamic covenant, based not on a concept but on a relationship, not a theoretical exercise but in a two-way conversation, can bring hope to our human story so we can sustain our society to serve the needs of us all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ed. So we'll now turn to Michael, Dr. Michael, the Reverend Dr. Michael Barnes. Welcome. Your taxi did better than I feared. You walked. That's why you're here.
I jumped out of the taxi. That's how
Right. Well, that's how you got here. Yeah.
Sorry about that.
Anyway, thank you for doing that. And for those who don't know, Michael is an honorary fellow of the Margaret Beaufort Institute. You were at Heathrop, and you're now emeritus professor of interreligious relations at the University of Roehampton. And you have been for many, many years very active in Interfaith. So I think you also been told, Michael, that you're going to talk for about 15 minutes about from your own religious perspective, the best result of the past 30 years of dialogue, and then go on to talk about the most pressing issue. Something along those lines?
Something along those lines.
Okay, excellent. Well,
I fear it may be a little longer than that.
Anyway, just to say to everybody, when our 3 panelists have spoken, obviously then we'll turn to discussion. But I think it's best to have all presentations first before we have the discussion. So yes, over to you.
I do apologize for keeping you waiting. Circumstances beyond my control. Well, we meet in far more somber and painful circumstances than was ever considered likely when this seminar was first mooted. Not that long before those dreadful events of October the 7th, I responded to an invitation to join not that long before those dreadful events of October the 7th, I responded to an invitation to join the local Jewish community medical court. It was a lovely occasion. An elderly lady told me how consoled she was to sit and listen to the Hebrew words of Torah ringing round the synagogue. Her gentle face came back to me when I got the news of the massacre. A week later, October the 14th, I joined the community a second time for Shabbat. Their grief was palpable, the pain was beyond words. So forgive me if I don't attempt an overview of where Christians, Jews, and Muslims have been over the past 30 years. We've never been so forgive me if I don't attempt an overview. This response is going to be more personal than prescriptive. 30 years ago, I was teaching religious studies at Heathrow. My expertise was, maybe still is, Buddhism. And I was interested in the different forms of yogic practice which filtered into that tradition. I saw it as part of my task to introduce students of philosophy and of theology to the religious worlds that impinged on their everyday lives in our capital city. I pursued that goal by getting them to reflect on the experience of crossing a threshold into another place of worship, synagogue, mosque, Fernandia, a good wine. And I would get them to ask themselves 3 questions. First, once you've had a chance to settle in the space, what points of continuity do you notice between what is familiar and what is strange? Secondly, what do you make of the discontinuity and the strangeness? Thirdly, what echoes of the known continue to resonate in the unknown, and vice versa? 3 questions, 3 levels of learning and understanding, where faith very often becomes interfaith. Gradually, we find ourselves drawn away from familiar convictions and encouraged to explore difference and diversity, not in order to construct some interreligious hybrid, but in the terms of my study of Buddhist yoga, to learn a discerning mindfulness about how human beings touch into matters of ultimate truth and value. 30 years on, and I think I'm doing much the same, but without the emphasis on actual movement around places of worship and from one place to another. The same guiding questions can be applied to an intellectual journey through texts, through written and oral traditions, and to the conversations they provoke. What has changed for me in those 30 years? Well, to continue the personal angle, I blame Cambridge. Thanks in no small measure to the time I spent here on my geriatric PhD, as I used to call it, I've become sensitized to the otherness which goes on haunting, I remember making a great deal of that image, what we like to think of as a familiar and homogeneous religious culture. The other is not over there on the edges of our world. If I'm doing my job as a responsible theologian, I am on the edges of their world, learning about what it means to be us by listening attentively to what they have to say about what it means to be them. In that thesis that I wrote, I focused on what Nostra Aetate, Vatican Council's document and other faiths, has to say about the identity of the Christian Church being bound up with, and in an important sense dependent upon, the revelation of God to the Jewish people. I wrote about Christianity emerging from within, I called it a Jewish matrix, and about Judaism as always prior to, never superseded by, a Christian sense of self. Sometimes same, sometimes other, always provoking a deeper learning. 3 rather dense books later, I feel I may be a lot closer to getting that principle right. I hope anyway. Christians exist in relation with the other. What the church offers in terms of witness to Christ acts in a sort of dialectical tension with what it receives of the grace of God already permeating the entire scope of everyday human experience, including the religious. To put the same point another way, Christianity only comes properly alive when it is communicated or translated into the terms it learns from other cultures and religious worlds. Now, such a move is not without its risks. The wisdom of other religious traditions can be pillaged for useful ideas which are then, inverted commas, fulfilled in the all-powerful Christian systematic overview. There is, however, more to dialogue than an attenuated form of monological proclamation, more even than respectful speaking coupled with a little listening. Dialogue is more like a form of hospitable welcome, in which the roles of host and guest alternate, and attention is paid less to what is said than to the manner of the interpersonal relationship itself. Such external dialogue feeds back into an inner self-reflection. 30 years ago, the primary idiom within which I tried to tease out my incipient theology of religions was Buddhist. That's what I knew. When I lived and worked in the little Punjab of Southall in West London, I became more and more at home in the world of Sikhism, discipleship, while at the same time trying to make sense of the proliferating religious world of Hinduism, from the Vedas, to yoga, to Bhakti, and modern revival movements. And I was also privileged to teach Catholic Christianity at the Muslim College in Ealing. I was the professor of Catholic Christianity at the Muslim College in Ealing. Can you believe it? I was. Although in many ways I found it a daunting experience, I always came away intrigued and consoled by the energy with which students engaged with serious theological questions. I shall never forget, as the war in Iraq was getting underway, a sharp but deeply moving discussion on just war theory. Now, I'm no Islamicist. What I know about Islam comes from knowing Muslims. Persons of faith have taught me that it is precisely in the interpersonal relationship that those echoes of the known continue to resonate in the unknown. But what do they tell me about my faith? How to return to myself, finding an integrity of faith while bringing coherence and consistency into these different voices ever competing for my attention. About 10 years ago, I started teaching Jewish-Christian relations with a rabbi at Heathrow. It gave me the opportunity to catch up with some important developments in the understanding of Christian origins and to reread Jewish traditions, this time in company with the likes of Levinas and Buber, Rosenzweig, and Abraham Joshua Heschel. In attending to my own inner dialogue, I have found the Old Testament prophets come alive, reminding me of a God who calls a people for himself and speaks through the suffering of those who cry out for justice. To pick up on the question raised for our seminar this evening, the most important result of the dialogue of religions is not that an intra-Christian consensus has emerged about the systematic ordering of theological claims, is rather that a number of ethical and political questions, from the ecological catastrophe to the scourge of religiously inspired violence, have shifted the moral climate within which faith is practiced. A wise friend once said that the first concern of the theologian must be to watch your language in the presence of God. Maybe we should add, and in the presence of a suffering humanity. We read our great texts in particular contexts. The two speak to each other. In multicultural Southall, I quickly became aware that the exotic smells and the sounds and the sights been a more prosaic and contextual reality. 2 weeks ago, I went back as a very part-time acting parish priest at St. Anselm's Catholic Church, where I lived those years ago. I admired the glitzy new railway station on the Elizabeth line, and I was less impressed by the soulless blocks of flats which are now looming over those wet and dirty streets. Otherwise, nothing much seemed to have changed. The places of worship I had visited with my students were much the same, as indeed was the welcome I was given. In such places, faith matters in all its beauty and its glorious confusion. Yes, there's a great deal of suspicion and anxiety about threats from the other, strangers and outsiders who sometimes have memories of trauma, even persecution. And yes, again, management of diversity and difference is never straightforward, whether in a multicultural melting pot like Southall, or in much more dangerously fractured parts of our world, as we have witnessed in Israel and Gaza. But care needs to be taken not to polarize the theological and the political, but to find ways of exploring the space between. If religion is sometimes the problem, it is not naive to suggest that religion can often provide the solution. For all three Abrahamic traditions, God's revelation, whether through Torah or Quran or in the person of Jesus Christ, is a divine act of loving generosity which we human beings are asked to recognize and welcome. That we struggle to do this and fail cannot take away from something all of us share, the sheer wonder that God has created this world of ours and asks us to be responsible for maintaining its integrity. That wonder is often reflected in the patience and kindness human beings continue to exercise towards each other, virtues that grow from ways of life that support and motivate all persons of faith. Now, let me begin to sum up with a word about what has been achieved in the dialogue between religions, and then return briefly to the tricky question of the relationship between the religious, the theological, and the political politics. The most powerful statement of Nostra Aetate is the threefold imperative: acknowledge, preserve, and encourage the spiritual and moral truths found among non-Christians. I always have to stop when I hear those words. It's incredible. Acknowledge, preserve, and encourage. Don't put them back. Acknowledge, preserve, and encourage. Now, that was 1965. Happily, the language which describes people by what they are not has shifted towards the titles they themselves use. We've moved on from textbook stereotypes about world religions to the lived reality of persons of faith, from a model of religion as system to one based in practice, in tradition, and community. We have begun to value what others teach about themselves, and in so doing, we are learning to appreciate the importance of what these days is called religious literacy. Religions are not the esoteric beliefs of those new atheists dismiss as faith heads, but the deep sedimentations of the spirit of a culture which any society neglects at its peril. At the same time, Catholic Christians in particular have become more sensitive to how the primary sources of theological thinking, scripture and tradition, are to be brought into dialogue with the wisdom of pastoral practice and the experience of daily life. The Vatican Council did not produce canons and condemnations. It worked with scripturally based meditations on certain key themes, key ideas, most obviously reconciliation and unity, the dignity of the human person, the call to holiness. The first section of Nostra Aetate seems rather bland and obvious in its reference to the questions that people ask about the meaning of things. But this is the first time that the discourse of history of religions has been used in a conciliar document. It provides not just an introduction to the main, original section on relations with the Jewish people, but subtly shifts attention away from the familiar, at least Catholics anyway, question of the salvation of the non-Christian, by hinting at something broader, more generous, more open-ended, the meaning of religious pluralism itself. Why these religions? Nostra Aetate has become something of a charter for interreligious relations, of course, and it's inspired a number of responses. Two stand out. Double Emet, written by Jewish rabbis and intellectuals, was first published in the New York Times in September 2000. A Common Word, addressed by Muslim to Christian leaders in October 2007, emerged in the wake of Pope Benedict's Regensburg lecture of September 2006. More could and should be noted, but they're all parts of a public discourse about the place of religion in a multicultural, secular world in which all people of faith are exhorted to acknowledge, preserve, and encourage the spiritual and moral truths found in sacred texts and funds of wisdom. Let me conclude with one thought about where all this may be leading. What holds the rich diversity of religions together is precisely faith. And an issue for so many communities is how the integrity of faith, commitment to visions of truth, can be maintained in a sometimes strange and hostile world. That persons of faith have different ways of configuring faith is obvious, but the guarding of difference, that specificity of faith which confers a particular identity, is not in itself a problem. The problem arises when religion goes toxic, as it were, when the naturally inward-looking and conservative mindset of any traditional creed is turned outward, demonizing some threatening other. The root of all conflicts is not difference as such, but competition, a rivalry often rooted, it has to be said, in the traumas of history, which, if it is not acknowledged, leads to binary and increasingly hard-edged oppositions. Suppress or ignore the cry of the suffering other, as Michel de Certeau warns us, and it will simply come back in another way. That, perhaps, is the instinct of bad religion. But what of good religion? The primary insight of the Abrahamic traditions is that before we speak, we are addressed, spoken to by God, by God's own word. Whether the divine imperative is understood as hear, or follow, or recite, the differences of idiom to which they give rise are rooted in a culture of hospitality to the other, whether another person, other texts, other symbols and images. And treated with generosity and respect, this often gives rise to a fairly common experience. The more one learns about another tradition, the more one learns about one's own. The question for all of us is whether we're content just to consume what we've learned, adding it to the sum total of material possessions with which we surround and console ourselves, or whether we allow its very otherness to shift our sense of self-sufficiency, not just to open up other perspectives, but to be shaped by them, changed by them, and to build in us qualities of empathy, forgiveness, and reconciliation.
Thank you very, very much for that. Tim, we turn to you. You've been introduced.
Yes, thank you so much. Beginning, of course, by echoing the gratitude that's already been expressed to the Lady Margaret Beaufort Institute for hosting this interfaith event and celebration, I suppose, to mark its felicitous 30th anniversary. My own tiny institution, the Cambridge National College, owes a particular debt to the Institute since we took our baby steps in the first 3 years of our tentative existence as tenants. Susan O'Brien and her endlessly forbearing staff at the Institute. Most grateful to them for their guidance as well as their patience. Still a warmly and fondly recollected episode in our evolution. Also in this building, I recall the first event that ever took place, and the building was only just opened, still virginal. The first event was an interfaith event between Catholics and Muslims, a day-long conference on Muslim and Catholic Mariologies. And over the years, this faculty has been the hatchery for a range of sometimes faltering, sometimes extinguished, sometimes still quite promising initiatives of an interfaith nature. And those of you who are interested in the genealogy of faculty cultures might want to reflect on why this faculty in particular has such a long-standing interest in theologically nuanced engagement between primarily the Abrahamic faiths, but more recently the traditions of South Asia as well. So what we've been invited to contemplate this evening has been two things. Firstly, proposing an event, an episode, a drama in Interfaith that we regard as being particularly significant, and then, relatedly, to consider ways forward, the path ahead. My sense, having been in this industry, as it's sometimes cynically described, endlessly conferences with tasty buffets and the exchange of platitudes and final communiques, is that generally, despite falterings and human failings, we are collectively moving in roughly the right direction. But as has been noticed by everybody this evening, this is a rather dark time to be burnishing the brand Abraham, which is not behaving particularly impressively at the moment in Gaza. There's a real world out there, which perhaps is a reproach to all of our theologies for simply not trickling down and healing the real world. Academics sometimes have an extravagant view of their own impact outside the roads of academe, and it's, I think, a reproach to us all to read the recent joint letter of the churches in Palestine on the current grievous situation there at the front line. And as a small embattled community, I think deserve our particular concern and prayers. Again, given the nature of this faculty, a lot of the interfaith work here has been historically rooted. We've always had a professor of ecclesiastical history. We have had strong interest in crusade, reformations, and the like. And certainly the way in which I have attempted to pursue the interfaith, my interfaith theology, has been through recognizing that this is something that is not new. For the faculty, it's effectively new. Much commotion took place when a Rabbi, Nicholas DeLange, was appointed to teach Judaism here, whereas hitherto, for generations, it had been sort of mild-mannered Anglican clergymen. The insiders themselves breaking that consensus were regarded still in the 1980s as likely scandalous, but we've moved on from there. But we do have a prehistory. In the case of Islam, of course, having the perhaps accidental advantage of coming after the other two major Abrahamic traditions, our founding document, the Quran, and the early history of the religion formulates itself sometimes quite affably, sometimes quite polemically in relation to two traditions that were already assuming the contours of their majoritarian definitive form. And the earliest Christian reflections on Islam sometimes portray a good deal of maturity. John of Damascus, interesting to reflect that a father of the church served as Chancellor of the Exchequer for the Umayyad Caliph. The world of Christianity was more versatile than it's sometimes thought. And he left us with the first dialogue between a Christian and a Saracen. And Matthew, with his dialogue with the Nestorian, Catholic, or Timothy, also demonstrates that at quite an early period, many of the recurrent understandings or misunderstandings, cliches, tropes of this very important conversation were already taking shape. Then, of course, in the 19th century, when the somewhat reiterative form of this dialogue or polemic started to shift as a result of European encroachment taking an increasingly imperial and secular form, you have Abdul Qadir al-Jazairi, hero of the Algerian resistance against the French, writing his letter to the French when he was in captivity in France, after having dialogued extensively in captivity with various priests, some of them rather irenic and saintly, who clearly garnered his admiration, others rather snide and polemical. In his letter to the French, we find a sign that the Muslim world had somewhat belatedly woken up to the fact that Christendom was now not quite that sparring partner which had marched with Islam for so long, but was now something different and moving in, to many Muslims, unimaginable direction. So on the basis of this complex history, we try to forge a theology that is faithful to the heritage, but at the same time recognizes the complexity of our operating in the world, which David Ford calls complexly religious and secular, an environment which stretches our capacity to remain loyal to what we take to be historical patterns of faithfulness, but at the same time opens up new academic methodologies, higher criticisms of scripture, interrogations of former forms of consensus, interrogations following Kant's of the former Hellenistic basis to much of our metaphysics, a vertiginous and challenging world, but one which the best of our thinkers, I think, has regarded as a positive challenge rather than a terminal threat. So in this faculty, there have been a number of initiatives, but given the brief that we've been given, I shall not spend time talking about those which end up in remote corners of university libraries to be consulted by mistake every 30 years or so by PhD students. I've been involved with rather a lot of those. One of the initiatives which I'm particularly fond of is the joint Cambridge-Tübingen conference, which happened between Christian and Muslim thinkers, people like John Milbank and the late Prof. Furbo have been pioneering with it, which produces a volume every couple of years, for which the university library refuses to buy because it's 140 euros, and they grumble about not having the budget. So to what extent is our quite intricate theological work and our bridge building actually likely to be noticed even by PhD students if they won't even pay for the online subscription to these lovely volumes churned out by Murrah Seabank every year? One can quite quickly become disillusioned and wonder what it's all for. So I'll focus on another event in which drama, this faculty did play more than a passing role, which is the episode already alluded to by Michael, the Common Word Initiative. Now, this wasn't hatched in Cambridge or in Tübingen. A little bit of prehistory to what is sometimes regarded and billed by the actually continual output of serious monographs about this initiative as the most significant Muslim-Christian initiative in recent times. But the prehistory stems from a strange reversal, which perhaps Abdul Qadir al-Jazairi would have been perplexed by, which is that although the contemporary Muslim perception of Christendom is that it's now something secular, and its depredations, capitalistic or military in the Muslim world, are to be understood in terms of material or strategic advantage rather than in terms of crusading. Following the Iraq invasion in 2003, a strange reversal of those perceptions across the Muslim world became visible and with remarkable rapidity. Things don't often move very quickly in many Muslim countries. But what one found following 2003, to the great alarm of many, was the sense that the American incursions in the Middle East were religiously motivated. So you have the episode, the translation of a lot of American monographs, many of them with the same title. Look up American theocracy on Google or on Amazon, and you'll see plenty of texts with that title, many of which were rapidly translated into Arabic. David Domke's book, God Willing, Political Fundamentalism in the White House, War on Terror and the Echoing Press. Paul Valladay's influential article, which was noticed in the Muslim world, Bush has Christianized the war in Iraq. General William Boykin, who led the hunt for bin Laden, saying, America will only win against Muslim enemies if we come against them in the name of Jesus. John Ashcroft, the Attorney General, having himself anointed with holy oil when he took office, etc., etc. Very rapidly, we saw a darkening and a reversal of the Muslim perspective of America in particular, being no longer a secular republic with plenty of generally amiable Christians in it, but typecast as a kind of specifically evangelical, religious, warring, crusading state. And this was an alarming development for many Christians, already embattled, fragile in many Muslim countries following the rise of fundamentalist tendencies. And Semir Morpus, who's a Coptic sociologist, produced 3 volumes which were runaway bestsellers in Arabic, denouncing the new dispensationalist Christianity in the United States, Christian Zionism, the Christian idea that Babylon had to be conquered if Christ was to come again, documenting these with quite a fine regard for the facts. The Copts generally taking the Middle East or Arab side in these disputations. So this was the backdrop to this Common Word initiative. But the trigger was, as Michael has noted, the Regensburg Address. Benedict, not somebody particularly schooled in the niceties of interfaith, German professor, brilliant writer on liturgical reform, and I believe, having met him, a genuinely saintly type of scholar. When he took office, shortly afterwards, the people who had vetted John Paul II's references to Islam were removed from office and replaced by new people. The guy who used to, the Jesuit who used to survey John Paul's statements about Islam, aware of the hypersensitivity of many in the Muslim world, that individual was removed, and the new individual didn't spot the ambiguity in the Regensburg Address, which appeared, not unreasonably, to be supporting the view of a medieval Byzantine emperor, that what the prophet brought was just nothing, violence, unreason. This in the context of a papal academic address linking or seeking to reconnect Europe, Christianity, and reason. Regrettably, the Muslim fuse is often short on such issues. Lives were lost, a nun was killed arbitrarily in Somalia. And this prompted a number of Muslim scholars to see what could be done about this darkening horizon. The Christianizing, real or imagined, of American policy in Afghanistan and in Iraq, and also the Pope's alleged imagined suggestion that Western civilization alone was possessed of reason, ratio, and that everything else was still barbarian. So the question then arose as to if an interfaith initiative is required, some kind of reaching out, some sort of statement on behalf of the diverse, squabbling 2 billion Muslims of the world, how this could actually be done when Islam is not organized religion, but more resembles disorganized religion. There is no Muslim sacramental hierarchy or chief anything at all. The Ottomans had sought to create such a hierarchy, but it has no natural authority. How can the Islamic world speak to particularly anxious Christians in America, convince them that the Islamic world's intentions towards Christendom are and will remain benign? And the Jordanians were the ones who triggered this, because you can look at their precarious situation as a kind of trapezoidal imaginary state created at Versailles in the middle of the trackless desert, full, first of all, of Palestinian refugees as a result of one set of Western decisions, and then filling up with Iraqi refugees as a result of another set of American decisions, and not terribly stable in itself. It's not surprising that the Jordanians, despite their comparative poverty, were the ones who chose to act. I was involved in that process, not quite from the outset, but nearly at the outset, when Prince Ghazi of Jordan, who had a Cambridge PhD and is an able theological mind, drafted the letter, open letter to the leaders of the Christian churches called A Common Word, the intention of which was to kind of pour oil on these troubled waters at a time when the East-West balance seemed to be threatened by the resurgence of fundamentalism, the beginnings of ISIS and the Islamic State in Iraq, but also in the West with the emergence of quite radical, drastic Islamophobic forms of evangelical Christianity. So how would Islam speak to Christendom when Islam has no authoritative spokesman? And the novelty of Ghazi's approach was to create an open letter that he would then circulate, including to grey-bearded mullahs who've never used email in their lives, in a tearing hurry, with the world's media scrutinizing the process, in an attempt to get the world of Islam, Dar al-Islam, to speak with a unified voice in order to assuage those Christians in America who are capable of being assuaged. 138 Muslim leaders, including most of the serious ones, including some hyper-conservative individuals who one was almost surprised to see on the list. Ayatollah Misbahi Yazdi of Iran, and Yusuf al-Qaradawi, and a number of Taqi Osmani in Pakistan signed this document, which took its title from the Quranic verse, "Common word between you and us." This is coming from an Islamic world that is still almost medieval in its fervor. A recent survey by something called the Arab Barometer points out that in the last 10 years, there's been a re-religionizing of the Muslim world, and certainly 15 years ago when the Common Word was drafted, this was already very evident. We live in a time of intensification of Muslim enthusiasm. So this letter was then promulgated on the basis of this Quranic quote, Surah 3, verse 64. "Say, O people of the book, come to a common word between us and you, that we shall worship none save God, and that we shall ascribe no partner unto him, and that none of us shall take others for lords beside God. And if they turn away, then say, bear witness that we are they who have surrendered unto him." That the document is called A Common Word, an arguable translation. A good deal of academic work has been directed to unpacking the somewhat enigmatic Quranic phrase. But essentially what Ghazi and the other core team were proposing was that this common word should be, and the text comes packed with other Quranic and also biblical citations, it's a very scripture-based document, is that the love of God and the love of neighbor should be the basis for the relationality of Christendom and the Dar al-Islam, the abode of Islam. This was published, and it's very much a phenomenon of the internet. There still isn't an authorized printed version of it. It's on acommonword.com in multiple languages. And the galvanic consequences were quite striking, and to the signatories and to the Muslim conscience in general, quite reassuring. The intention was to get Pope Benedict to endorse it, or to say something benign about this love of God and neighbor being the necessary basis to our interaction. That took time. The first reaction was something called the Yale Response, 2007. A group of American Protestant theologians took out a full page in the New York Times and created a very deft theological response, accompanied by over 300 evangelical and reformed pastors, many of whom were taken aback by the realization that it was Christian America that was perceived as the purveyor of religious violence against a largely defensive Muslim world. This was a new perspective for them, and they responded very well to a beautiful document. Then the next year, 2008, the Yale conference, very high-profile event. I recall that I was escorted from the plane by a policeman. The plane landed at JFK, and a policeman came and said, "Is Dr. Winder on board?" And everybody looked at me as if I was an illegal something, and I was escorted, wondering where I was going. But of course, it was there to make sure that I got through customs properly and wasn't held up by Homeland Security because my name looked like somebody on their list. It was done at a very high level. Rowan Williams came, Miroslav Volf at Yale was one of the key players. And then 2008, the Cambridge Conference, Rowan Williams again, Miroslav Volf, and that was the largest ever gathering of senior Muslim theologians to happen in the UK. It was enormously important. All of the big individuals were there. Rowan Williams's response, which he then developed, is probably the most theologically nuanced response so far to the Common Word document, where he says 5 areas of dialogue have been triggered by the document: the need for love of God, love of neighbour, scriptural integrity, the life of faith, and the presence of differences. Finally, considering all this Protestant activity in late 2008, the Vatican invited us, and we sat with head of the Pontifical Council for Non-Christian Religions, I think it was called at the time, Cardinal Doran, who turned out to be a very profound individual. And for me, the best moment of the encounter was when we asked him to pray at the end, and he did, and it was a very heartfelt and beautiful prayer that kind of indicated that we had won through, and the Pope gave his approval to Catholic Muslim Forum, which would happen shortly afterwards, which was a huge event. I recall the discussions we had over which throne Benedict would be sitting on, and the reception. This was a major issue for our interlocutors. This is all something quite new. Vatican is in many ways even stranger than Cambridge, if you can imagine that. But he did effectively endorse it. And the journalists were there. ABC News was there. The Economist did a story on it. It was an example of Interfaith not ending up in a dusty shelf on North Front 6 in University Library, in a kind of dusty sepulchre forever, but a genuine impact, and something that subsequent conferences and events and popularizations and publications have kept alive, which cannot be said for most interfaith academic initiatives. On the Muslim side, which has been my principal concern, I have been patronizing through one of my little charities a series of translations of the document, together with 2 commentaries, one by the late David Burrell and another by myself. It's been well received in Albanian. I've had letters from Spanish bishops appreciating the Spanish translation, and Latin America. The most recent translation is into Romanian. That should be done next month. So even though it's a 2008 initiative, it still is gaining traction. And I think that the conclusion for this has to be that you can ground a document in very sound theology and in scripture with a very old-fashioned view of the integrity of scripture, and at the same time make a significant impact in the real world. Measuring the impact of such initiatives precisely is beyond our powers, but the Common Word, I think, has lived up to its billing as the most significant Muslim Christian initiative in recent years, and PhD students in Germany and elsewhere continue to contact me, and I have to give the same old interview as to, no, I didn't write it myself, which is a urban legend. Prince Ghazi of Jordan wrote it. So that, I suspect, is how I would move our two themes together. An initiative that has been important to me and successful, but at the same time indicates that all is not lost, and there can be a really pretty traditional type of document that does justice to the historic development of faith in the two rival traditions, that can be a genuine force for reconciliation, understanding, mutual respect. We don't have to make big doctrinal concessions in order to get along with each other. Sometimes it's by quarrying the best and deepest aspect of our tradition that we can gain that mutual respect. As an afterthought, in one of the subsequent forums where we received from Pope Francis, we had a lot of fun discussing this and also pointing out how wonderful in Muslim eyes is the traditional Tridentine Mass. He seemed to enjoy that.
What a wonderful note to end on. Thank you to our three panelists. Now, we are running over time, but, you know, we're talking about really important things. So I think wine can wait a little bit. Seems to me that's the right priority. And I'm sure that we really want a good 20 minutes of discussion, at least 20 minutes. Yes, you agree with that. That's excellent. So the floor is open to you to ask any questions. Now, who is brave enough to start? Excellent. You start.
Excuse me. My name is Leanne. I'm an MPhil student in religion and conflict. So I think about these things quite a bit, and thank you so much for your contributions. I was wondering what you think about the idea of tolerance. I think that in a lot of interfaith work, there's this notion of working towards some sort of harmony, some sort of respect. But I'm wondering, in a more pragmatic sense, where you think the role of, one scholar called it antagonistic tolerance, where, you know, tolerance where people don't necessarily respect each other, but they're not in active conflict. Especially thinking about sort of where we are right now in the world, this idea that people might hate each other and not act on it as a sort of temporary solution. And I'm wondering if you think that it's worthwhile to give credence to such an idea, or to reject it as something that still isn't actually solving the crucial problem.
Excellent question. Who of the three would like to respond to that? Would you like to?
Very brief thought on that. A friend of mine, we were discussing this, said once, tolerance is not a Christian virtue, patience is. And I didn't want to get into it, but I do think there's an important distinction there. And from a Christian perspective, patience, I think, gets us off on the right foot, awaiting. I wrote a whole book on this, believe it or not.
Well, you are the right person to respond.
Well, you get to the end of a book and you wonder whether you've actually done what you said you would do at the beginning. But the book is called Waiting on Grace. And I really was playing with the theme of waiting. At the end, I was trying to move into my sort of political perspective on the dialogue of religions. And I was rather resisting going down the road of tolerance. I'm not sure whether I did enough with the theme of patience, but I would want to stress that from a Christian perspective, coming out of Paschal mystery of the suffering, death, and resurrection of Christ, patience is at the center of all of that. Putting up with what you can't change for the sake of the other and for the sake of the common good, as much as anything else.
That's interesting. And do you want to add anything to it, Tim?
I think tolerance is a bit poo-poo, isn't it? You know, oh, we're going to tolerate you.
But actually, the edict of toleration has been hugely significant in the whole development of pluralism and acceptance of one another. So, but I wonder today whether in a moment of conflict, when there's serious conflict, there's no point seeking how can we affirm one another. We're not there. It is about how can I tolerate you, someone I really hate. You have to start there. And having got there, you then have to build on it. Prince Hassan of Jordan, one of our patrons, talked about taking advantage of those moments of outbursts of peace. So I think in terms of your work, Leah, it depends what the context is. If the context is conflict, then yeah, it is. I tolerate you enough just to get going, and then of course I think the where you'd want to get to, in my view, is how can I affirm you? I mean, that's the whole covenantal theology. I want to be able to affirm you whilst hanging on to my particularities, my truth claims. But you can't start there when you're in a conflict situation.
Jim, you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think the category of tolerance runs the risk of being reduced to a rather cold social contract enlightenment kind of idea. And one would like to see a theology warming it up somehow and speaking not of tolerance as the basis for the collaboration of human beings, but rather curiosity and respect. I think that's a better basis for human interaction than simply tolerating people, which sometimes can seem rooted in Enlightenment ideas of truth being indiscernible anyway, so we might as well muddle along together. I think that genuine curiosity and interest in the internal libraries of other rich religious traditions is a much better, more humane basis for human interaction.
There was a question with the green Willie. Yeah. Try and speak up because we got people online. Yeah.
I'm from the Architecture and History of Art faculty. In your introduction, you mentioned, I think it was implicit in kind of any interfaith conversation that non-religious people are kind of the elephant in the room. And Dr. Sim, you mentioned at an academic level, the echo chamber we might find ourselves in, kind of writing about religion. But in kind of a religious setting, what is to be done in terms of dialogue to kind of the quote-unquote non-believer? But in a deeply situated kind of sense, what is the situated kind of answer in kind of, again, perhaps in the last 30 years, what is the relationship that we have with, for example, atheists? Dr. Sim, I know you've written kind of about what it might be, you might disagree with kind of describing it as kind of Islam, for example, it's a therapeutic mode, and that's the relationship that is kind of deeply situated in kind of the context of today, but is there a contextual kind of relationship that we can have today that is unique to today with the non-religious?
That's a hugely important question because we are certainly, well, in this part of the world, in a very secular landscape. Jim, do you want to start on a response on that?
I think this has bewildered many of us because historic positive faith has always assumed that the religious other is religious, and the idea of there being very substantial and apparently morally coherent, scientifically advanced a-religious societies is not envisaged by any of our great thinkers of the past and continues to wrong foot us. However, if you look at the Islamic literature with sufficient assiduity, you will find people referring to the need to respect atheists because of what Islamic theology refers to as the Ismat al-Adamiyya, which is that by shared Adamic descent, human beings have an inviolability. And that's irrespective of what subsequent religious affiliations or choices they might make, particularly in what's called the Hanafi tradition. It's an established position that certain rights are innate in human beings, irrespective of belief or lack of belief. That would be the place to start. People like Recep Şentürk in Turkey, for instance, have tried to develop a theology of positive engagement with the a-religious. But it is a challenge. It's a challenge.
Ed, you want to say something?
Just to add one thing to that, in the Jewish world, of course, the concept of secularism is very much been part of Judaism. To be a Jew, you say you're a Muslim, you're making statements about submission to God. You say you're a Christian, you're making a statement about Christ, the divine. When you say you're a Jew, it's not at all. It's a piece. It's a bland piece of it's a place, it's a tribe, Judea. And so I think from the Jewish point of view, engaging in dialogue with the other, it's always been there, right? The other is always there, whether the other is a religious or non-religious person or a different faith person, different perspective, it's the same principle. And I'd say within the Jewish landscape, having a non-believing Jew who self-identifies as a Jew has been in existence for quite a long time. Hard for Christians and Muslims to understand. Although I think there is an increasing number of people who identify Christianity, but not necessarily believers.
And Michael?
Very briefly, I have a great deal of sympathy with people who say, I am spiritual but not religious, depending, of course, on what you mean by spiritual and what you mean by religious. But I've got good sympathy for that. When we look at what's happening in the West, there's no doubt that institutionalized Christianity is beginning to fall apart a little bit. What's coming out of it? Well, a great deal of energy and enthusiasm. I've been reading about the synod in Rome. Okay, that may be a rather specialized forum, but there are some interesting things happening there, and it is far from clear to me that Christianity is dying in the West and it's being taken over by secularized forces. There's a different way in which people are relating to the Christian mystery, keeping it a little bit at a distance because they don't want to be caught up too much in the institution, which has not exactly helped matters in recent years, I think.
What I would want to add to that is that, and so I think it was you, Michael, that religious literacy is extremely important. That's something that we have, that we have lost within a very secular society, is in discussions with those who are not part of a faith tradition, that the understanding of what religion or faith or anything like that means. And there is a real, I mean, we don't have time for it now, but I think one of the real challenges in schools is how are pupils taught about religion. And I think a lot of it is far too institutional. And what needs to be brought across is much more principles of what it actually means to have a faith. And I think there is a very, very large topic there that you've touched on. You have a question.
Yeah, thank you all for your contributions. My interest in this is really twofold. On the one hand, work is quite related to it. I recently did some work on the Marrakesh Declaration, particularly looking at how that could be applied to a UK context. The other side of my interest in it, and one I wanted to raise with you, is the kind of theological and philosophical side. So I'm actually currently doing my MPhil in the Neoplatonic ideas of religious pluralism during the Renaissance. And I'm quite interested in what is the sort of philosophical justification for tolerance and in general engagement with the religious other. And I know that in the Christian tradition, for example, you've got this very, very interesting kind of strain of Neoplatonic metaphysics, particularly embodied by Nicholas of Cusa, who's very, very deep theological humility, kind of negative theology, which makes him very reluctant to make any positive assertions about God, directly leads to an openness towards other religious perspectives. So Nicholas of Cusa writes this idea of the doctrine of divine ignorance, and then he also writes, totally not coincidentally, a treatise called On the Peaceful Unity of Faith, where he has a Muslim, a Jew, and members of all different cultures and religions coming together, because to quote that dialogue, all different rites will ultimately be led to one orthodox faith. So there is this very strong tradition within Christianity of pluralism, which has this very profound metaphysical and theological basis. So, I mean, you're very welcome to expand on that from a Christian perspective, but I'm also interested in, is there a theological, like a robust theological defense of pluralism in the Jewish and Muslim traditions? If you could speak a bit about that.
Right.
Pass that one on to us.
Who wants to do that one?
Well, the Islamic tradition is a concatenation of different traditions. Certainly, if you look at the formal Kalam theology, which is, I suppose, the equivalent of scholasticism in the Latin West, you will find a fairly hard-edged exclusivism, coupled with the idea that these surviving relic communities of earlier outmoded monotheisms can still be allowed to exist. Across the conceptual border in the world of Sufism, for instance, Ibn Arabi dies 1240 from Muslim Spain. William Chittick at Stony Brook has written a very interesting book on Ibn Arabi and the problem of religious diversity, in which he proposes Ibn Arabi as very much a religious pluralist, because only God is absolute and every expression of him is relevant, but God, through his overwhelming love and compassion, the preeminent predicate of God in the Quran, consents to be in the erroneous images that human beings have of him. So he kind of descends into images and into doctrines that may not be right, but no verbal framing of the divine nature and purposes is ever going to be completely right anyway. So that would be the place to look, Chittick's book on Ibn Arabi.
It's so similar to Kuza, I think. That's actually really interesting.
Yeah.
Ed, would you like that?
And on Ibn Arabi, by the way, we just received the Ibn Arabi live.
Yes, indeed.
Very
yes.
pleased about that.
Lucky things. Yeah.
Yes, yes. So you're welcome to look at that in terms of the Muslim texts from that period within the Wolf Institute Library. I don't have much to add. This is not something that I'm terribly familiar with, but I would say, Tim mentioned sort of medieval period in Ibn Arabi. Of course, from Jewish point of view, you have Maimonides, who's grappling with these sorts of issues. I'm very familiar to Muslim sources as well as Christian sources. And that sort of intriguing medieval interaction, which Anna knows much more than I. But one of the things that Maimonides talks about is preparing the ground for Torah. So creating space for another faith. As allowing space for the revelation Torah to be received. But I don't know, Anna, do you?
I don't think I can do that on the hoof, to be quite honest. I'd quite like to take, unless you want to add something, Michael, I'd like to take 2 more questions if they're very quick. And I want to look at this side of the room because I've been ignoring this side of the room. Are there 2 more? You have a question, yes.
Very quick one. It's a word which has filtered out every so often, but thought should be up there in lights. In dealing with any communities which have entrenched division, one crucial thing is respect for the other person. I always thought that about Northern Ireland, actually. So I wonder whether you could say a little more about this virtue. The word was used just 3 or 4 times, that's all, as far as I heard. So I wonder if you could talk about that. It seems key to me that it goes beyond any kind of doctrinal formulation, but it has everything to do with an interpersonal relationship, in fact. And of course, it's critical to the development of any helpful human relations anyway. I just wonder.
And that ties in extremely nicely with the question that we had about tolerance, because one of the ways that one can respond to that is you don't have to agree with someone, but you can respect that there is a difference. That would be, would my colleagues agree with that response? And respect, it's also what you mentioned there, it's the interpersonal side. It's as speaking as more as a historian than a theologian here, it's when you are able to see the other as another human being, just as human as you are, doing the same human things that you do every day, it's much more difficult to attack in any way that other person. It's when you start seeing people as that group and when you lose the individual. So I think part of it, I think it is a very important part of interfaith, is that you can profoundly disagree with another religious doctrine, whatever, but you can respect whatever aspect of it, and you can teach yourself to respect it.
I agree it relates to toleration, but it's more active.
Oh, yeah, no, I'm saying it. Yeah.
Toleration is a bit bland. It's got no drive.
What I meant is it embroiders, it goes further on the question that was asked about toleration. I think one of the ways one could also have responded to that was we need to go beyond toleration and respect.
Yes.
Does anybody want to add? Is there another question in the room? There is. Anna, you're allowed to ask a question.
several people online. There are some questions, but I think one question sort of summarizes some other questions. There is a question about critical sifting, and then there is a question about fairer society, creation of fairer society without harassment and freedom.
I'm not sure that's a quick question.
But I guess some of the questions amount to asking what would be the solution now to move forward towards the one key point, towards a greater harmony. One thing.
One thing,
It's a good short question.
that is indeed, well, we could all try to give one word to that. I don't know who wants to go first.
Okay, I started off.
Why
That's
not?
one. We're all minorities. I put that, I think, between over it. I think that's one of the biggest shifts today, the recognition that we're all minorities, whether we're Christians, Jews, Muslims, or any others. And I think somehow that sense of my relationship with you in terms of us all together being minorities is the way forward in the dialogue. That would be my one word.
I think I might go with the word empathy.
I was just going to say empathy, and could I add to it, what's the difference between empathy and sympathy? How does one grow out of the other? They're different, but they interact with each other. So imaginative empathy, does that lead into sympathy? Anna, you know more about that than I do. Using the imagination to think through the consequences of what we believe and what we say, both the negative side of that and the positive
Yes.
side of that.
Yeah, and I would even, 2 words, self-knowledge helps a bit as well. One's always quick to criticize the religious traditions of another, but have a good hard look at your own. And it was, I think it was John Ford, I can't remember, I think it was him, David Ford once said this to me. Imagine what it's like for somebody else who's, in my case, not Jewish, attending the synagogue service. What do they see? What do they hear? And that's quite a good one as well. How would it come across to somebody else? I think that's quite healthy. Tim.
My word, the last word, it could be poetry. I've always found that the quickest way to gaining a respect of other religious traditions is to look at their great literary masterpieces, which are not polemical, apologetic, but come from the heart. And if you can read John Donne, for instance, or Thomas Traherne, it's really impossible to dislike Christianity, I think. There's so much of human beauty and wealth and depth and the movement of the spirit in these great poets. And that would be my recommendation.
Okay, let's end on that note. I think we should thank our 3 speakers here, and thank you all for being here and for your attention.